So, well, apologies for being me and not Guy Goodwin. I'm similarly pale, male, and stale, so you don't have to shift your expectations too much. But I've also been interested in this, and I've learned a lot from James and from the team and from everyone in psychedelics. And I think it's actually a... Can you hear me up the back? Oh, all right, okay, all right. How's that? I'm better, good, okay. So Guy emailed this morning to say he was stuck in Bicester. So if this was the Great British Bake Off, this would be a cake I'd prepared earlier. So it's a talk I gave in the United States in December. And it's trying to orientate people about the whole issue about having new medicines which are derived from what I've called street drugs. And I cannibalized shamelessly slides from some of the other speakers. So if any of them start looking very cross, you'll know it's because I've got their slide up there. But I do apologize in advance. And I'd like to add my thanks to James and to Catherine, Liam and the others for organizing a day which I think will likely prove to be very interesting and potentially very helpful. I must say that the whole psychedelics field is actually something that has reinvigorated psychopharmacology. I think it's very, very interesting how this has actually made people return to psychopharmacology with fresh eyes. Okay, so these are my disclosures, which are not coming up. Okay, right, just to say that I put this in context. If we think about how we get new medicines, new chemical entities are created by biotech companies. This is actually not difficult. You could get a new chemical entity created for a relatively small amount of money. The hassle and the cost is really taking them through the whole development program, from the initial studies in animals for toxicity through healthy volunteers and so on and so forth. Rather interestingly, and to my mind paradoxically, these drugs which are not commercial per se have also got to enter into the same process. And I think that's very, very interesting. So the arguments that we hear about a lack of new medicines is not because of lack of new chemical entities. Those could be developed. But it's about the hassle of the rest of the process. And that is unavoidable if you're going to turn something into a medicine that's approved and has regulatory approval and so on. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about very briefly ketamine, because I think ketamine kicked this off. I'm going to talk about cannabinoids. I'm very, very briefly talk about MDMA, and then psilocybin. I'll skate over the psilocybin stuff. I've probably got too many slides. And we're going to hear more about it from Robin in terms of mechanism, and then from Guy. So ketamine, this is a dissociative anesthetic. It's always called a horse tranquilizer. It's actually a dissociative tranquilizer. The reason you see it on David Attenborough programs when they tranquilize the rhinoceros or whatever is that if you did that with a regular anesthetic, they wouldn't breathe and they'd die. So ketamine's got a different mechanism of anesthesia. It doesn't suppress your respiration, but it dissociates you. And it's very, very useful in places where you can't give proper anesthesiology. But it's been repurposed, as people say. It's been taken, this old drug has been taken and used as a treatment in mood disorders. And I think that's worthwhile thinking about because it's an exemplar for what would happen. It's also, of course, a street drug. It's abused at various gatherings of young people. So the initial RCT was by Zarate and colleagues. This was an infusion of ketamine. Antidepressant effect was pretty fast onset. I mean, typically we check for an antidepressant action 2 to 4 weeks after starting the antidepressant, but this was really within hours. So this was a game changer in terms of the trajectory of the effect. Antidepressant effect was maintained for 7 days. It's not just so-called unipolar disorder, but also bipolar. And this is really being confirmed in the further trials and the literature. So this isn't a rogue finding that didn't predict the future. This actually seems to be a real finding that ketamine is helpful. And this is one of the initial studies done by Carlos. And you can see they had a placebo control, the red line, major depression and bipolar depression. And also, there's a marked effect on suicidality, which appears to occur very, very quickly. Carlos is doing a trial. I visited him about 18 months ago in Washington, and being Americans, they always go a bit over the top, but they have a US government-funded trial where they're flying in suicidal patients from all over the states to give them ketamine infusions. And I think this may mean that this is a treatment for acute suicidality. Now, that's good, but also it raises the prospect of thinking about that in isolation, which actually may not be part of a good care pathway package. Dissociative effects experienced by all, alter perception of time, and so on and so forth. Is ketamine ready for the clinic? Well, as placebo-controlled trials, that's what we need. It's perhaps a bit different from the other psychedelics, and I'll talk about this with MDMA, in that the other parts of the treatment package don't seem to be so important. So with MDMA and with psilocybin, we'll hear a lot about this today, it's not just the drug, but also the drug in combination with the psychological input or the human input that we hear about, which is very important. That's less emphasized with ketamine. Now we're going to hear about the pathways from Robin, but I thought I'd just mention this one issue, which is of great concern in the United States. Now, you know in the United States that they've got this epidemic of deaths from opiate overdoses, over-the-counter prescribed painkillers. This is not just a US problem. We're seeing a lot of this in Europe and a lot of it in this country as well. And there's a concern about ketamine being abused because of its history as a street drug. Now, there's a very nice paper done by my friend from Stanford, Alan Schatzberg and colleagues. They looked at the effect of ketamine, which of course is thought, Robin will tell you this, thought to act through NMDA receptors and so on and so forth, AMPA, but they blocked the effect of the opiate system. So this is apparently a system which is divorced from the ketamine effects, but in actual fact, they mitigated or reduced the effects of ketamine. So this is an American Journal paper. It's a very, very nice scientific design. They actually replicated the antidepressant effect of ketamine and then blocked it with either placebo or with the opiate antagonist. And as you can see, if you do that, you markedly reduce the effects of the ketamine as an antidepressant. So this raises a number of questions. I mean, obviously there's the question of abuse, but there's also the question of whether the opiate system and reward systems are involved more generally. And I think this is a question that will come up again scientifically when we look at all of these drugs. Because remember, a key part of turning anything into a medicine is looking at the safety of that drug. Okay, cannabinoids, I'm going to talk about this very briefly. Just to say, this of course has been made legal in Canada, which is going to be very interesting. My daughter lives in Toronto and she came over recently a couple of weeks ago and I said, has it made much difference it now being totally illegal in Canada? She said, no. In actual fact, it's probably, reduced the allure of smoking weed. There's been a big change in this over the years where we see more THC and less CBD. The CBD probably has better medicinal effects, and that's been trialed as a potential medicine. So it's not a street drug per se, but it's obviously part of what people smoke when they smoke cannabis. Cannabidiol has effects on the brain, antidepressive, anxiolytic. These are all possible effects. This hasn't been confirmed in the same way as the antidepressant effect for ketamine, but certainly the effect in psychosis, which has been championed by Professors Murray and Maguire and so on, is very notable. In this institution, we've done work which is built on discovery science, looking at the antipsychotic effect in animal models. We've looked at blocking induction of psychosis, and there's now actually large trials going on, partly funded by government agencies, looking at whether this is a helpful treatment for schizophrenia. And this, again, is very interesting. This is something that comes from a different avenue, perhaps not that different from classical pharmacology if you think about it, but nevertheless, it's a new mechanism of action for psychosis. And I think that's very interesting. Moving on to psychedelics, of course, I'm not the expert in this. I've got James down the front, and if there's any tough questions, you can ask him. Just to say that this has certainly energized interest. You can see James Rucker, a psychiatrist and honorary lecturer in the Institute of Psychiatry, talking about the effects of these agents. So what are psychedelics? That's Humphrey Osmond at the top, I think. Psychoactive drugs that produce mental state changes, perceptual, psychic, somatic. There was a lot of, if you look at the history, it's fascinating. There was lots of debate about what to call these drugs, and psychedelic now seems to have stuck. Classical psychedelics, we've got a list of them here. LSD, DMT, tryptamine, psilocybin. They're all a bit different pharmacologically. They all, however, seem to interact via your 5-HT2A receptor. That seems to be key for the psychedelic effect. This is not particularly new. When I worked in lab pharmacology in the 1980s, we did experiments with a 5-HT2A agonist, and we all treated it like it was nitroglycerine. We were very worried about absorbing any by chance and becoming psychotic. So this is quite clear, and there's a couple of nice reviews out recently which James can supply. And there you can see the 5-HT2A. Now, remember a few moments ago I talked about harms. Regulatory agencies, the FDA, which is really the forerunner of the EMEA, was charged with just examining safety for the first few decades of its existence. Efficacy came in later. And so safety for any treatment is key. And of course, no treatment, whether it's a drug, a device, or an operation, is entirely without potential harms. But this is the physiological harm toxic ratios relative to the dose of alcohol. And you can see that alcohol's there. Less lethal than alcohol is towards the top, and more lethal than alcohol down. And you can see that most of the drugs that we're talking about, psilocybin and so on, are actually pretty safe. Remember, safety is never entirely assured. So that's why we monitor drugs for decades after they come on the market. Occasionally you get rare safety issues. When I say rare safety issues, very uncommon safety issues which are actually lead to a drug being withdrawn. And there's particular scenarios where we don't have data. So for example, dosing pregnant women, you're not really allowed to do experiments with that. There's reporting agencies that collect the data, but sometimes it takes a few decades to get a signal of whether a drug is safe or not in pregnancy. Of course, you can do studies in experimental animals, but that's not entirely reassuring. But in terms of harm, it looks fairly reassuring given the data that's there. Okay, so this is from James's review. This just goes through all of the old stuff. Now, we'll hear about, I'm sure many of you know, that there was an era when these drugs were allowed to be used in medical research, and then that was stopped because of bogeymen like Richard Nixon and so on. If we think about the old trials, we've got to remember that this is really the equivalent of Model T Ford methodology. So clinical trials really started in the middle of the last century. They've evolved considerably even during the time that I've been involved with them. And so we've got to be aware of that. We can't actually look at the past and expect them to have performed or to perform to the quality controls that we would now demand. So bear that in mind. But nevertheless, there are certainly a lot of suggestions of potential benefits here, which I think are cause for further investigation. So this is a nice review done by James and Luke Jellin and others in the audience. And this is the FallOff in publications. And of course, the history of this is very interesting. Particular interest is this era here, and we all think about Timothy Leary. My wife's a big Cary Grant fan, and of course she refused to believe that it was Cary Grant who introduced Timothy Leary to LSD until I showed her in, I think, one of James's publications. So it's a very, very interesting history and social period. Okay, so you all know about the studies that have been done. Robbins in the audience. This is the open label feasibility trial. I think really huge credit goes to the Imperial team, to Dave Nutt and to others for actually initiating this and having the sheer bloody might in this to get this trial underway and then to make it work. So, I mean, really, I think this is the start of the modern part of the story. So you all know that this is an open trial, 20 people, 6 female, current moderate or severe depression, failed at least 2 antidepressant treatments. Some of the participants are in the audience, I believe. Primary outcome, standard inventory of depressive symptoms. And there's the study design, which I won't dwell on. And just to say that certainly there was a signal of potential benefit. You can see that this is baseline and then 1 week post, an enduring effect. So I've shown you the ketamine story to some extent. That started in the 90s, and we're actually just getting to the point where the FDA may approve a form of ketamine, S-ketamine, as a medicine. So this is really the beginning. James talked about a narrative. This is the beginning of really quite a long process. And I'm afraid, unless you can overturn all accepted regulatory agencies, it's going to require quite a lot of more research and looking at safety and so on and so forth. But that's really what we should be doing. Adverse events, no serious adverse events. This is really quite familiar. Trial criticisms, well, I think it's, of course, academics, dare I say it, are very good at being critical of other people's work. My take on this is it certainly gives reason to do further research, which I think is perfectly reasonable. No one's saying it's a definitive trial. I think it's actually a triumph that it took place at all, given that at the time this was an illegal drug and nobody made it and so on and so forth. So, future directions, well, this is what needs to be done. Feasibility RCTs, there needs to be a multi-center RCT. Compass, Hans Eriksson, who's the medical director of Compass, is there, has kindly joined us today. They've got a multi-center RCT in treatment-resistant depression. Guy is the principal investigator. He's just emailing British Rail to complain about the service here this morning. And mechanism studies. But money's unlikely to come from pharma. So if you talk to people who are involved in medicinal cannabis and so on and so forth, there's a real blockage in terms of having enough money to do the correct studies. So again, I think we need to think about how we negotiate this pathway to being a medicine, but also negotiate it in a way that's viable commercially. I'm sure that can be done. Other clinical psychedelic studies, there's lots of interest in things like alcohol, LSD-associated psychotherapy for anxiety. I've not mentioned the MDMA literature, but MDMA, of course, for PTSD is extremely interesting. That's something that really has resolved in the past year or so into being something that's really scoped for future treatment. I've spoken to many of the Americans who are doing the research, and the MDMA seems to work in combination with the psychotherapy package for people who've been suffering from PTSD, US military veterans for decades. It somehow seems to unlock the process, and that's very, very interesting. I think the pharmacology of the individual drugs is going to be important. LSD may be attractive, but there's a problem with the pharmacokinetics and so on, which can limit its usefulness. If you've got an adverse reaction, it can go on for a very long period of time. So I think we need to be thinking about this. But again, that's all part of psychopharmacology. Delivering psilocybin therapy, well, that's anticipated to be delivered in dedicated centers, day treatment. We'll hear lots more about this from people who are involved at the sharp end. Again, I think we may need to be rethinking how we deliver therapy in a sort of creative way. One of the concerns about ketamine in North America is that there's lots of individual isolated ketamine services. So you can get off a bus in Dallas, feel suicidal, go and get ketamine, and then get on a bus and go to Houston and so on and so forth. And it's not really integrated in a correct model of care. Now that's the United States, but we need to think about this in terms of pathways and treatment and so on and so forth for what are very common disorders, even the treatment-resistant ones. So to conclude, I've filled in for Guy, who's now here, so everything's okay. I think we've certainly got huge unmet needs with our current therapies. So if we look at the common disorders that we are concerned with, principally depression, anxiety, and so on, so forth, our medications, our treatment packages, our psychotherapies do work, but there's scope for much better improvement. And I think novel treatments and novel combinations of drugs and psychological packages, such as we should hear about today, I think are a very interesting prospect for future therapeutic advance. And of course, we'll hear about molecular mechanisms, I think, from Robin next. Is that right, Robin? Yeah, I'm not sure yeah, we'll hear something about that. And also, we've got lots of psilocybin RCTs underway. And the proof of the pudding, as ever, will be in the evidence from the trials. I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.